All right. All right. It begins again. A.H. Almaas and the Pearl Beyond Price. It's been a few minutes since we've um, embarked on this reading together. Please forgive me for my delay in continuing this, but I'm just going to jump right in. Where we left off was just at the end of the third chapter. So I figured let's just start with chapter 4 and we'll go from there. In in just a little bit of a context, I encourage you to go back to maybe to the beginning of this if you're new to this to get the breadth of the whole thing. It's like I try to keep these readings down to approximately 30 minutes. And so what I'll be doing is reading and riffing on what's read and trying to draw out what he's saying and be in the presence of it together. And you could say that the thing about Almaas that I really appreciate, right, is he is this rare mind, if you want to say, right, in this making this connection between something like the non-dual and the psychological. Now, there's a lot of people that and authors and thinkers that talk about this connection between ultimate reality or the non-dual and the psychological, but very few of them talk about it in specific terms. They say it's connected, but they don't really go into the minutia and show it's think through this connection as much as Almaas does. Now, he's very eclectic in his reading and his understanding. I think he was a scientist. I think he went to UC Berkeley, awakened in some sense, and it's just I don't. It's just rare. It's a rare bird, and the precision of his thinking is really gets in there and thinks through this. So I've gotten a lot out of reading Almaas, and so let's dive in. Okay. Okay, chapter 4. Beingness. To appreciate the autonomy of being and to see that ego autonomy is no more than a pale shadow of this autonomy. One must know being, but one can know being with a capital B only by being. Short of, or in addition to, this gnosis, we can illuminate the contrast by looking more closely at ego structure and its development. So what he's saying here is a perennial enigma, right? The one in the many, right? The ultimate and the unity and the difference, right? This sense to this paradox that, as he says, to appreciate the autonomy of being, one, the sense of unity of being is another way of saying that, and to see that ego autonomy is no more than a pale shadow of this autonomy, right? So in other words, the autonomy that you assume that you are, right, is just the tip of the iceberg of the source of that autonomy. That there's a singularity to you, but that singularity is a pale reflection, as he would say, to the singularity or the unity of something like being with a capital B, right? Yet he has this really brings up this enigma at the same time, right? That is at the core of our psychology. It's at the core, this enigma is at the core of what it is to be a self in the psychological sense of the word. Because that enigma is that we can only know this being through beings. That's apparently all we can experience is beings, right? But being itself isn't a being. Yet it seems to be the only thing going on at an ultimate level, but yet it hides in its multiplicity. So, right off the bat, he's presencing this perennial perplexity. And just look at your own experience. How much fun are you having being a self? How clear is it? So I say no more. In this in this section, we will investigate in more detail how the development of identifications and ego structure removes the child's experience from the realm of being. Looking at this issue from the perspective of the perception of the external world and one's relations with other people, and also from the perspective of the experience of the self. Then we can describe how, in the work of the diamond approach towards inner realization, the understanding of psychic structure made possible by objects relations theory can help us pierce through the identification with ego and thus experience the personal essence of being, right? So I think what we could say is that this perennial conundrum of being, right, manifests psychologically, right? It's this perplexity, you could say, is in some sense, I even venture to say that the psychological ego is in some sense the manifestation of this perplexity in a big way. And we all know this, right? Because, you know, how many times have you told yourself the right thing to do? And that's the last thing that you end up doing, right? There's a strange way where there is this, I apparently am this self that I proclaim that I am. Yet when the self tells itself what to do, right, the self doesn't go, okay, you're not a very good slave to yourself. You're somebody that you have to contend with. There's this kind of strange otherness to being a self, right? There's this, on one level, there's a unity, yet there's also a multiplicity, a multivocal manifestation at the same time. And that this enigma is what it is to be a self, right? And so he's saying, if we explore this psychologically and we look at human development and we look at the way the self is developed, that we may get some insight about that the pale reflection, the thing that I usually call I or myself or me or mine, there's a truth to that singularity, if you so to speak. Yet that singularity isn't the real singularity, right? The real singularity is being as such, right? And that you could almost say, and I think he's going to go on to say, that what you call yourself is actually in many cases, a psychological compensation for the loss of contact with being as such. And that from Almaas's perspective and like really keying in and through the work of objects relations theory, which is really cool. I like objects relations theory because it fundamentally like really thinks together the notion of self-other, right? That, in other words, objects relations theory is really keyed in on that there is no self that then is with others, that the self itself is a self-other relation, right? And so the way that it gets contorted is through self-other relations, right? That wherever you look, you'll see self-other in the self, right? And so it really, I think, is an amazing way of looking at things, right? This multiplicity. And so basically, Almaas is saying that it's through looking at that disconnection with being as such, right, and working through it, that something like being as such is the thing that we can become identified with, right? Or remember that we are. That's that sense of things. I think that's what he's saying, but we'll see. He goes on. According to objects relations theory, the development of ego structure through the process of separation individuation happens primarily by means of the internalization of objects relations through the formation of inner images of self and other. So I want to read that again. According to objects relations theory, the development of ego structure through the process of separation and individuation happens primarily by means of the internalization of objects' relations through the formation of inner images of self and other. Okay. To make sense of this. So I think he'd say that there is this, when we're born out of a person, right? First stage of individuation, right? We go from a unity with the mother to a separation with the mother. And then a second later, 2 seconds, hopefully not more than 5 seconds later, there's another unification back on the breast, right? And as the breast feeds the infant grows, right, through that relation into a more complex, becomes more complex and individuates, right? So that very relation, in a certain sense, affords individuation, which will create a new set of relations that form individuation, right? So this relational sense of things is the process by which we become an individual. So notice that you can't really separate that process. Like individuation is through relation, through and through. You just can't help but to think relationality is primary, right? Because it is, right? We're not things that then relate to the deepest level. There seems to be being itself must be something like a field of relationality, right? That turns into lots as relating, right? But the primary thing seems to be this deep relationality. And maybe this is what Almaas means by capital B being, but we'll see. He goes on. The object is generally the human love object. And an object relation is simply the relation between self and object, usually an emotional relation. Objects relations then generally refer to the mental representations of this relation, which consists of 3 parts: self-image, usually called a self-representation; an object image, usually called an object representation; and the emotional relation or affect between the two, such as love, anger, fear, or desire, right? So basically what he's saying is that he's paraphrasing the underlying thought or frame of objects relations theory, right? Which is the self is made up of multiple images, right? Of internalized love objects, essentially, the mother, the father, the caregiver, right? And that your self from an object's relations perspective is always paired, right? Internalized. So there's a self that has its mother object, right? Or the self that has its father object, right? And what he's saying is that these two, the way that they manifest in the psyche, the way they're internalized, is that the image of, let's say, the father and the self tied to that father is an emotional, an affective bond. So what holds them together, the hyphen between the two, is affectivity, right? And we know this. You could just think about your friends, right? Like we all have friends that have been married maybe married and divorced 3 or 4 or 5 times, and they always end up marrying the same husband or wife. Or the same person goes from job to job and gets always in the same conflict, in the same dynamic with every single boss that they have, right? and in our own selves, right? It's harder to see in ourselves, but oftentimes I think about it as like this. It's like from looking at it in terms of objects relations, a relational kind of way, it's the way that I'm incomplete or wounded around my mother, let's say, turns into this myself as being this, say my mother was overbearing or emotionally needy, which of course reverses the way it's supposed to be, right? I'm supposed to be the needy one and she meets the needs and she doesn't need anything from me. And I get to let go and have that experience and individuate. But say instead, here I am, this like need, and then she needs me. And all of a sudden I need to save her, right? That's going to create some strange contortions, right? And so I have to become a self, right, that can't get its needs met by the mother, right? Therefore, needs to become distant from the mother. But the mother then grabs hold of me, right? And then I feel guilty. And then I give the mother what she needs, but then I lose myself. And then that conflictual frustration, let's say, right? That fear and that anger and that frustration, and like that becomes, I grow up, and if it's not complete or resolved, it becomes an internalized, right, sense of myself along with this other person with this kind of affective charge. And so then what I do is I walk out in the world when I'm no longer with my mother and I'm already anticipating, right? And therefore notice or I'm attracted to or create the right conditions to index the world such that I'm hired by that boss or that manager that reminds me of my mother that I'm already defended against, right? And therefore draws her into conversations that are very much like my mother, and we get all hooked in. Da, 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 da. And what he's saying is that, so it's, one of the ways you look at it is like we walk around with empty folding chairs, and for my pale reflection sense of my neurotic self, for it to exist, I have to, wherever I settle, I lay out these folding chairs and I have to populate them with all of the incomplete people that I have in my life, right? And I have to make sure that there's the person that I'm struggling to get to like me, and there's but won't ever like me, and then the person who needs all this stuff from me that I can't satisfy, and that's frustrating, and then all the different roles. And to the degree that I'm identified with that is to the degree that I need those empty chairs filled with those people so that this sense of myself can exist. But what's insidious about that, right? If you think about this, is this sense of self is about the struggle to resolve that relation. But that very impulse to resolve it requires the relation to be there. That's the insidiousness, the attempt from the identification with the self other structure, right? From its perspective, it's struggling to finally get this person to accept me and get this woman to love me and finally get my needs met and or finally get the person away. And these are all on one level very innocent claims, right? And on one level true claims, but to the degree that they're from an identification of unresolvedness, what I don't notice is that emotional bond becomes the thing I'm identified with that needs those relations to be there. So there's this kind of level of insidiousness that I think we can really appreciate, right? All you got to do is look at the reoccurring patterns in your own life, right? The reoccurring relationship struggles that you get in, right? This is all pointing to, I think what Almaas would say is all pointing to a way to look at that is to look at them in terms of self other bond, right? That those emotional bonds. And of course, you can, the fact that he's the light which sees that isn't the is not identified with those things. So there's implicitly in describing this is pointing to a horizon that is beyond that or other than that. Okay, I go on. Thus, ego formation occurs in the context of a relationship to a primary love object, the mothering person. Sorry, Mom. It does seem to be all about you ultimately. This is the source of the English analyst W. Roland Fairbairn. Is that how you say it? W. Roland D. Fairbairn. Fairbairn? Fairbairn. Naming his approach the objects relations theory. Okay. Every situation or interaction between infant and mother is an object relation, except in the very earliest phases, in which there is no differentiation at all. The infant always sees himself in relation to the mother, not in isolation. So just notice here, like how primary relation is, right? We start in a relation, but that relation is the whole thing. So there's no differentiation, right? Goes on, the memory of such interactions are mental representations of the objects relations. The infant remembers not only himself, that is the image of himself, but always also the image of the mother in the interaction. The fixation of these representations in the mind is called internalization. As more of these representations accumulate, which means as more memories are retained and fixed, there begins a process of organization of these representations. This organization of internalized object relation is the task of the separation individuation process, which ordinarily culminates in the development of self and object constancy. I think I'll go on here. According to Kernberg, the process of internalization and organization of the object relations occurs through different mechanisms depending on the stage of development. He groups them in three categories: introjection, identification, and ego identity. Introjection is the easiest, most primitive, and basic level in the organization of internalization process. It is the reproduction and fixation of an interaction with the environment by means of an organized cluster of memories, traces, implying at least three components. One, the image of an object. Two, the image of the self in interaction with that object. And three, the effective coloring of both the object image and the self image under the influence of the drive representative present at the time of the interaction. This process is a mechanism of growth of psychic apparatus. Then he relates this definition of introjection to the mechanism of identification. So identification is a higher level form of introjection, which can only take place when the perceptive and cognitive abilities of the child have increased to the point that it can recognize the role aspect of interpersonal interactions. So in some sense, another way of talking about this is I think he's talking about the process of logos, right? The process of, on one level, you could say the first intimation of self-other or differentiation. The first one is like we call introject. So another way of saying introject is he says it's the most basic because it's like in Gestalt psychology, they say another way of looking at introject is to swallow something whole without digestion. right? My mom calls me a loser and I just swallow that information whole and it becomes imprinted in me. It's an introject. It means like I swallow it without digestion or integration. That's the first boom. But as the psyche develops, as the logos becomes more present in the child, right, we start to find more and more through lines of connection where we see, oh, there's actually me. There's not just my mother, there's a me and my mother. Huh. And that there's a difference between those two. And that difference is colored by the emotional tone of that relation, right? And you can start to see this on one level, this kind of this separation, but yet finding the through line between and how they connect. And that is the process of differentiation. It's the process of logos, as far as I can tell. Okay, it is. I will stop there and perhaps I'll begin this again tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining. Welcome back.